It's a bold title, I know, but hear me out. In this interview, I'm going to explain why socialists won't be able to reform capitalism, even if one managed to somehow get into power. Socialists work in the same fundamental banking system as capitalism. This means that despite their best intentions, they don't have a way of fundamentally changing our system of economics away from endless privatized debt. In addition, I'm also going to discuss how the natural tendency of capitalism concentrates power and ensures that reformers are kept out of whatever nature. In the second half of the video, I'm going to discuss Islamic economics, the principles of which help to run some of the biggest interconnected economies in the world for centuries. If we borrow just a few key ideas, we can radically change our system, radically redistribute wealth, and improve and reach economic justice. Now, this interview is with Sheeza Shah from UpEffect and the Re-Envision Business podcast. Thank you very much, Sheeza. Highly recommend that you guys check out her content. The links are in the description below. Timestamps will also be there, so if there's a particular area that you're really interested in, you can skip to that. But I would say that the earlier sections do give you essential context to understand some of the later sections. So even if you watch on slightly faster speed or something, I think it's still worth checking out. With that said, I hope you do like the content. If you do like it, give us a like. Consider subscribing if you want to see more of our stuff and be notified for it by hitting that bell. And also leave me a comment below, because I want to know, do you agree or disagree with my fundamental thesis, which is that socialists work in a capitalist playground and aren't going to be able to radically change it? And also I want to know, what do you think about cryptocurrencies? Because this is something that we're going to be covering in future episodes. We have our thoughts, but want to hear from you. With that said, thank you very much and hope you enjoy the interview.
Omer, thank you for joining me for Re-Envision Business. It's such an honor. I've watched and read Rational Religion articles for as long as I can remember. I think when you guys started your journey, I've been following your work since then. What inspired your interest in the study of how our economic systems operate?
I think it was, the last 5 years in particular, politically have been quite tumultuous, I think that's the word, in the sense that there's been lots of revolutionary type ideas, or there's been a feeling that something drastically needs to change. And in many ways, that's been there since 2008, and we had the crash, and there was this kind of civilizational shock in Western civilization that, we thought we were in the great moderation and things were going swimmingly, and turns out how economic systems aren't invulnerable. And then after that, you had massive bailouts of the super rich, and followed most often, especially in the UK as well as in much of Europe, austerity measures. And 7-8 years after that, you started having people like Jeremy Corbyn, Bernie Sanders, etc. You started having people saying, actually, we need to distribute the wealth that we have a lot better than we are. So I think it was kind of, we see that in the culture, and we see lots of, poverty, homelessness, even in our, very rich countries. And as soon as you start seeing that and you start looking into it, at least for me, and I know, my brother and people that I've spoken to, and I'm sure yourself as well, you start wondering, how can we improve this situation? How can we change it for the better? And a lot of the responses have been, let's say from the political left in particular, that how we need to tax this more, how we need to have better regulations in this area more, how we need to just make these changes here and there, and we'll be fine. And if we just went, I know they don't exactly say this, but if we went back to the 50s, we went back to the 70s, at least in terms of the spirit, then things would be okay. But what I've always wondered is, what makes you think that if we go back to much heavier regulation, we're not going to end up exactly where we are now, 15, 20 years later? What makes you think that there's not an inherent drive towards wealth inequality and injustice that's inherent in the system itself? And if you entertain that as a possibility and you start looking at, well, what is our economic system? How does it really work? Is the natural history of modern economic history, of the modern economic world, something which was contingent, something which was just because of a few people's decisions, Thatcher's, Reagan's, etc.? Or actually, is there something more inherent to the system which is driving those changes, which it necessarily tends towards the kind of world that we see? And as my suggestive statements have already indicated, I do believe that it's something more inherent. And something underlying the way that our economic system works that has resulted in these inequalities. And that produces, all kinds of social problems. And my own field of work, I'm a psychiatrist, or training to be a psychiatrist. You have so many mental health problems, and there are diverse causes of mental health problems. Even if you lived in an economic utopia, you would have mental health problems. But we do know that there are social drivers, and inequality and poverty and the stresses that brings is a major cause, in my view, and I think most people would share it, of our mental health crisis. Because if you're hand to mouth, obviously, but also if you're a single mother and you have to work and you have to take care of kids, that can produce stresses for you, for the children, etc., etc. So the economic system is something that bleeds into our entire world and into our geopolitical scene. So I think it was a recognition of how can we fix this problem, and then, is there something inherent in the problem? And then from my own perspective, looking into Islam, and when I started learning more about Islamic economics, I was like, wow, people should know about this, because actually Islam has very, very delicately, very carefully identified root causes and proposed solutions which are becoming more well appreciated as time goes on.
I mean, it's really interesting how your day-to-day work, and you're seeing much of the impact that our current economic systems have had on the day-to-day lives of individuals, and you're seeing that through your job on a day-to-day basis. What do you think given that we're still operating under the same economic systems that have existed for the last several decades, what do you think those systems have to offer, and how have our financial and business models and the organizations that we all work within, how have they evolved around these systems?
I think if we're talking about in the modern West, obviously we have a capitalistic system. The only alternative that people think there is to that is essentially communism. So if it's okay, I guess I'll talk a little bit about what capitalism entails. And
that would be great.
Its major good factor over communism, for instance, is the fact that individual effort results in individual reward, and you have genuine, legitimate property ownership. And it essentially means that if you put your labor into something, that you can actually see the reward of that and you can benefit from it. Whereas communism obviously is, from each according to their capacity and to each according to their need. So it says, I don't care about the natural inequalities that do exist in, maybe effort, maybe intelligence, maybe all different kinds of skills. I'm going to take from you what you can give, but I'm only going to give back to you what I deem, I being the state, or what I deem is necessary essentially for your bare survival. And it means that people were reduced essentially to human machines in many respects, and they weren't really able to express themselves. They were kind of just laborers, ironically ended up much more alienation than the system which Marx opposed. So that's kind of one of the major problems with communism. Obviously, there are others, and that's one of the major boons of capitalism is that you can own property, you have a reasonable amount of economic freedom. If you have the capital, if you have the money, you can spend it on things that you want to do. So that's an excellent point of capitalism, which shouldn't be underappreciated. The problem is that it doesn't cater for everyone. And there are certainly losers, big losers. If you have a system which is driving increasing inequalities, then you have states which don't necessarily, most often, at least in the UK and the US experience, especially US, actually it's worse there, don't take care of people in terms of the people at the very bottom rungs of the ladder. And they don't provide for everyone. They don't make sure that everyone has a basic minimum of provision. Then it becomes a kind of, to varying degrees, essentially the Wild West, where, you can do very well if you've got the money and you are, rob some people, or you're a bank, although the same thing. But if you don't have the capital and maybe you started off on the losing side of the equation, then it can mean that those losses can perpetuate. And we idealize people who, manage to make something from nothing. so to speak, but actually they're very rare, and there are far more invisible people who actually really, really struggle, and they're the vast majority. So capitalism, unfortunately, as a system, doesn't cater very well for everyone, but it does give people individual freedoms, and it allows some people to flourish. But what we really need is a system which does both. We need a system that has provision for people on a basic level, and it also allows people to flourish. And I think what I'd argue is that capitalism is too imbalanced and communism is far too imbalanced, and we need a happy medium. Now, social democracies seek to achieve that. They seek to do that through taxing and spending, etc. But maybe we can get onto this. The natural history of capitalism has shown that that doesn't really work, and it always tends to go in the opposite direction. And it requires an enormous amount of force and activism, etc., even to get small gains. As to the more general point, which many people who are advocates of capitalism make, that you live in great wealth and don't you enjoy your flat screen TVs and iPads, etc. How can you say that the system that produced this capitalist policies are negative for the world? Shouldn't we be trying to have more of these? I would remind them that actually the wealth of the West was largely stolen, and in many cases, pardon the dramatic phrase, but built on rivers of blood. We had genocides which were committed of native peoples. We had massive stealing of native people's wealth. We had colonization all over the world. You had slave labor that built the empire of cotton, which America got rich on. That existed until reasonably recently, and then through political control, they were also able to enact protectionist policies, and were able to benefit that way. So a lot of the things which people attribute a lot of our growth to kind of, let's have open markets, let's have all this kind of lovey-dovey free stuff. Free market stuff, it's just not how the Western world grew. It grew on colonization, on murder, and on massive trade barriers. And so it's therefore just not an argument in terms of why we should be looking towards capitalism. We should be absolutely running away from capitalism because it's been horrendous in the past, and the nature of its destruction has just changed recently.
How much do you think of the issues that exist within capitalism are due to the leadership and the political power that exist in individual countries, and the impact or the control that they have over their economic policies versus the economic model itself?
I think this is going to be very esoteric and therefore probably quite unclear. So feel free to clarify it. I tend to think that both in science and in every level of abstraction, things work in mutually dependent systems. So, for instance, the traditional view of genes and of the cell, of biology, is that it's DNA focused. So it's DNA, genes make proteins, make cells, make tissues, make organs. So it's very, very one way up. But the modern view of biology is actually it's very, very two-way, because the cell decides what genes to express. And if you have a segment of DNA, a large segment, you can actually express that in different ways. And it's also responding to stresses in its ultimate environment. So you have this kind of very bottom-up process with DNA up to proteins and to ultimate manifestation and phenotype. But you also have a very top-down flow. I'm not sure if I said all that right, but you have bottom up, you have top down, we have the external affecting the internal. So I kind of see that at many, many different levels, and I think also in the economic world, which is that you have a system with certain inherent policies, the structure of the system, and that itself will produce certain problems. But it will also, because of those problems that come out, so for instance, if you have a system that tends towards inequalities, you're going to produce, elites. And once you have elites, then they're going to economic elites, then they're obviously going to try and capture government, which you can do with money, unless your people are very, very morally upright. But you exert enough force, then it's going to break things open. So once you have a system which starts to produce economic elites, then they start to capture government, and then they become political elites, and then they can rig the system in their favor even more. So then they can change policies to give more wealth to them, and then they capture more of government, and they can keep on changing policies. So you have a system from a top-down level which produces inequalities and which concentrates wealth. But that itself accelerates the whole process, I guess, from the bottom up, because those people then change the system to continue that cycle. And also, even on another, perhaps more abstract level, it also determines the kinds of values that people have. Because if you have a society which caters for, runaway wealth expansion, then that becomes something that's idealized in your society. And in the absence of religion and other moral values, and in today's world we've largely done away in the West with religion, people take that as their god. So people take that as the thing to which they desire and which they want to bring closer to them, is money. So it also changes the moral values in your society, and it makes you very, very distressed if you don't have money. So everyone's chasing money, and of course, if you have a culture which chases money, and you have an economic elite who are getting richer and also have those cultural values, then everything feeds into itself. So the system becomes mutually reinforcing. So I don't think you can really separate the two very, very cleanly. But I do think that and also actually, just the last point on this, I think in a way that's also demonstrated by the system of interest in terms of how it was legalized, because it took many, many centuries for it to be legalized in the West, and for the current economic policies to even be morally accepted by society. I think it was in Henry VIII's time, basically, it was in the 16th century, that interest was finally legalized, because Christian economists and jurists weren't able to, propose an alternative in some respects. But it was hated. People thought that people who charge interest are the lowest of the low. They were in a certain ring in Dante's Inferno. So it was something that was greatly morally looked down upon. But a small group of people, I guess, lobbied and changed that. And then that itself changed the culture over the centuries to the point where it's now completely accepted, and we have a very, very materialistic culture. So my overall point was,
driven by interest.
Yeah, exactly. So it all becomes mutually reinforcing, in my view. Does that make sense?
It does. And for context for our listeners as well, there's roughly about 2,000 billionaires in the world, and together they hold over $760 billion in wealth. So they have obviously a lot of power in terms of how much they can influence policies and the direction that governments take, because a lot of those in power also either strongly connected to those that have access to this wealth, or they themselves are belonging to the same community. In terms of the wealth inequalities that exist in the world today, so we see 700 million people are still living in extreme poverty. How have we allowed capitalism to grow into the position that it currently holds, and the hold that it has over so many of our systems, whether it's business, whether it's media, whether it's politics? Do you think our economic systems are working?
They're working for some people very, very well. And in the same way that you have inequalities and winners and losers within a country, you also have winners and losers on the global stage. So, much of the damage that's wreaked by our countries and by our corporate culture is invisible to us. It's in, all the resources that are being plundered from Africa, in the capture of the IMF and the World Bank in many respects, at least cognitively. I'm not saying it's a giant conspiracy, though it may be. I don't know. I'm not privy. But, in terms of the models that people produce have ended up in the IMF and the World Bank giving structural adjustment loans to countries in sub-Saharan Africa, which is basically, we'll give you this money plus interest if you change all your policies to be a neoliberal model and liberalize your resources, liberalize your policies so that resources can be taken from you. And for instance, you saw, a lot of those people who are living in that extreme poverty that you mentioned are in that region. And where are we now? 60 years ago, their national economic growth was reasonably okay. It wasn't amazing, but actually they were developing, and the development has massively started to slow down and in relative terms is probably completely stagnated in many parts. And the economic problems obviously cause, civil unrest and social problems. So I think it's working well for some people, and it depends where you are on the ladder. But quite obviously, the fact that we have 700 million people in extreme poverty, and the fact that there are many more in relative poverty, and even in our own countries, we have people on the streets, I think shows a massive failure of the system, in 2020 to actually deliver on its promise, which was the general upliftment of all. Because that's what people who are very pro-capitalist say, that it's the best system for uplifting the world, and it's been the most effective system of doing that. But I think the facts stand contrary to that, and there's either something wrong with the system, or there's something wrong with the people implementing it, or both.
So let's take debt as an example, which you mentioned earlier as well. How does debt contribute to wealth inequalities? Because debt is very much a core funding mechanism that exists in, whether it's personal financing, it's student financing, or business financing, or anything else. But debt is very much strongly pushed to the average person. So how does that work, and how is that contributing to the problems of capitalism?
I think it's in many ways the major mechanism of capitalism. So it's benefiting those who implement it extremely well. It's not a problem for them. It's a problem for everybody else. So, I mean, debt is really the core that underpins how our economic system works. If we zoom out on sort of on the big picture, what do we have? We have banks. Well, what are they? They're private corporations. They're private corporations who have the ability to print money. And in fact, in the UK, they make about 97% of the currency in circulation. So we've given power to private corporations which have a profit motive to print money and give that out to people. And as you say, the major way that we do a lot of our financing, is through debt financing, is through interest-bearing loans. And if we analyze that, you can see it's a bit of a sham. It's basically a load of people get together who are very, very rich and have lots of capital. They start a bank, and people who don't have money, who are in need, go to them. And they say, I need some money for this project, this house, whatever it is. I need some money. I don't have money. And what they then say is, okay, I'll give you this money, but I'm going to charge you for it, right? And people think that this money is money that they already have. And they think, oh, well, the interest is justified because they could use that money better in other ways. And there's an opportunity cost. That's all simply false.
But say that money is theirs and they're charging interest. Why is that wrong?
That would, I think, still be wrong. It's because ultimately, if someone's coming to you in a position of need for something, and you give that money to them while saying that I'm going to require a charge on this, what you're basically doing is you're putting them into a more difficult position overall. You're saying you need to go out and not only repay the principal, but you need to go out and earn that money in the real world and give that back to me. Okay. Meanwhile, I'm not going to actually share any of the risk of your project, because invariably they'll have had that loan secured on their collateral. So they say, okay, well, I'm going to secure this loan on your house or whatever. I'm not going to share any of the risk of your project. If it doesn't work out, I'm going to get this thing, right? And that itself, in my view, is bad enough, but it's particularly egregious when it's printed, which is how banks work. They print the money. There's no opportunity cost because the money didn't exist before they give it to you, right? It's new money. They print that money, and there's essentially no limits in terms of the ratios of how much they can print in terms of the actual capital that they have. So it's new money which they produce. They then give it to you. They secure it on assets, and then they charge you extra for the for having that loan, and you have to go out and earn real money. So essentially what you have is me as an individual, or me as a small business, I have to go out and earn real money and give it back to them, when what they've done is created money and given it to me. So it's already a completely asymmetrical, unequal process. especially when you factor in the fact that they're printing that money. And essentially it means that it's guaranteed profit for the banking sector as a whole, barring massive systemic failure, which tends to be, their faults, as we saw in 2008 anyway. Barring massive systemic failure, that the banking sector is invariably extremely profitable. And even when it's not profitable and everything collapses, because, as I said, because they're an economic elite who own the political system, they'll just get their buddies in government to give them massive bailouts, so they still win. Another issue with the interest-based system is that you can leverage your wealth multiple times over. So if you have some capital to begin with, then you can basically through leveraging massively gear up how much money you have. Because they'll say, okay, you have this much capital, we'll give you this much extra. Then you use that money to buy a bunch of assets, and then you can use that to continuously go up and up. And the reason why it kind of works out is because the bank is making profits off loans, and you're making good business with the money that you're getting through loans. So a lot of that kind of growth, a lot of that rapid growth in general, can be achieved through essentially not necessarily really earning that money. You're not necessarily producing benefits for the rest of society. You're not necessarily growing a really sustainable independent business model. And I think that goes to another one of the problems with capitalism is because of these things, because of these factors, essentially what it means is that in order to succeed, you need to start off with capital. And if you don't have capital, then you're going to be, basically a loser in the long run. So small inequalities can massively grow over time. So that's the underlying heart of how debt financing works, and it's inherently unjust because, as I said, it's completely asymmetrical. You're not sharing the risk. You're not giving further input. You're making them earn money. You're giving them money which you yourself made. You're earning basically a guaranteed profit. And if things don't go if the things don't go their way, then you take again another tangible asset through collateral. And it doesn't just work on the individual kind of bank to person level, but also on an international level with the IMF or the World Bank or individual countries giving loans to other people. And what they'll do is they'll attach a bunch of conditions to it. And essentially what it will mean is that they enslave them, because what you're saying is, okay, you have to take this loan from me. Okay, that itself is not necessarily terrible. Taking a loan isn't necessarily terrible, but you add the additional burden of interest. So even if it's 1-2% a year, that compounds over time. All interest is compounding, really, because the amount of money has to be paid back is increasing. So you have interest that compounds over time. So that's burdensome. And you have the original loan. So the only way really you're going to pay that off is if your growth is fast enough that you can actually get over the interest, the loan plus the interest, which is itself quite rare, especially if you're talking about less developed countries. If then you also have the conditions, various conditions, which are invariably neoliberal type, austerity type policies, and you say, well, we'll give you this if you open up your borders to take away your trade barriers, etc., etc. If you allow us to use your markets as consumers for our product, which is what they do, then again, it's injustice upon injustice, because financially they're tied down, they have a very heavy burden of debt, and they've had to essentially cripple their growth because they have to put all these nonsense neoliberal policies in there as a condition. So what it means is you as a rich country or as a international organization essentially control them because they owe you a lot of money and their money is increasing. And if things get really bad, like we saw with Greece, we'll be like, well, we can give you some more money. Would that help? We give you some more interest-bearing loans with conditions. And again, you have widening inequalities.
Would you think about microfinancing that exists within underprivileged countries, for instance, where a number of schemes and businesses have been set up around this? This market has really taken off, and a lot of people will often say that microfinancing is a great way of actually alleviating poverty. What are your thoughts on that?
I'll be interested in which massively rich country microfinanced its way to development. What you've seen in terms of how the rich countries developed is you basically have the exact same pattern all over the world, including recently rich countries, like South Korea or even China, actually. But especially South Korea is a very good example. The way that rich countries developed was they essentially had trade barriers. They had they promoted certain what's called protectionism. That's what I'm looking for. They were often very protectionist in many of their industries. It was the so-called infant industry policy that you treat your small industries like an infant. You protect it from predators, essentially. You help it to grow. You give it a lot of support. You give it a lot of subsidies. There's a lot of government state financing of industries. America did this. Britain did this. Britain did it extremely obviously through colonialism. They would destroy, parts of the Indian economy just to make sure that theirs is benefiting. They infamously, cut the fingers of many women who are sewing. And were in the textile industry because they were completely outcompeting the Brits. So the rich countries have done this to a huge extent, where they have been quite protectionist, and they have developed their countries through state financing. Now, if we're saying to the current underdeveloped countries, what you need to do is you need to have your small microfinancing, while they're not saying, okay, we need to do massive debt forgiveness. We need to help you to make your state more robust. We need to make sure that you have control over your own currency. We're not going to mess with your currency in terms of currency speculations. And we're going to help you to trade on terms that are beneficial to you and to us, but actually maybe we can be a bit asymmetrical. Then I think my own feeling is it's kind of a distraction, because no one really does proper development through these kind of small scale ways. There is quite a well-defined route to development, and it's been well trodden by the Western countries. But now they're saying you need to take every other possible route to development, while we'll still have all your oil and all your gas, and we'll still control you in many different ways politically. So I'm not saying microfinancing is a bad thing, or that it should be necessarily discouraged. But my feeling towards all of these kinds of new schemes is stop pretending like this is some kind of, this is the standard model of physics and we're having to work really hard to crack it. If only we knew the answer and maybe this will do. It's like, no, we know the answer. We know how you do it. Why don't we let the poorer countries implement it and help them to do that, rather than supporting much smaller scale things, which I think won't be as well fated ultimately.
So you mentioned earlier around your point that to be able to return some of the debts that individuals take on or businesses take on, they need to actually look at significant growth, either individually, or within the businesses themselves. We're seeing that same kind of concept applied to the venture capital industry, where investors will expect entrepreneurs to take on, they set crazy expectations around their business models in the hopes that they will build, billion-dollar businesses like Facebook or Amazon. And even the chances of investment funds making a return on those investments is one out of 10. And so a lot of the businesses that end up taking on those checks will go under. So what is, beyond the fact that, growth can, focusing on high growth within a business can be often a death sentence for the entrepreneurs who are deciding to go down this route. But beyond that, what is wrong with businesses that are looking to become a billion-dollar success? So what the monopolies that we see in the industry, the issues that we see that exist with companies like Google, issues that we see existing within Facebook, why is that harmful for entrepreneurs to aspire towards?
I think so. In terms of a lot of the big startups that have kind of gone down that route, they have been shown to have not necessarily the most sustainable business model. So, for instance, like your Ubers, which rely on kind of massive reputation gain and then a lot of financing without necessarily being profitable. And again, if that kind of financing wasn't actually available, if you actually had to turn a profit properly and have a proper business that is, at least somewhat profitable from the get-go, or have a good model towards that, then I think a lot of these kind of companies wouldn't grow as fast as they have. So it kind of lends itself towards producing these so-called unicorns. And I'm a big fan of zebras. Um, but in general, I think
it was, Umar was on we had a great Zebra Unite season of the Dazzle session where Umar was a panelist. So if anyone wants to watch that, we can post a link in the show notes.
Sure. But in terms of otherwise, I think what you should be focusing on as a business is to produce something that's socially beneficial and is a profitable business. I think if the question is kind of why shouldn't you try and become like Google and Facebook, if that means why shouldn't you try and be very, very successful, you should try and aim for getting innovative products that are that can maybe help to define a market early on and continue in that vein. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, I think. But if that means you're going to follow maybe some of the monopolistic practices that they have, and you're going to be gobbling up much smaller companies, then that's not necessarily a good thing. But I think as the individual entrepreneur, I'm not sure in some respects whether that's necessarily on you. I think if you were to be a very morally responsible person, it would be, and that's very, very laudable. And that's something I know the work that you do with UpEffect is about kind of producing socially beneficial and socially responsible companies. But ultimately, this is a question of regulation. If you're not regulating companies and you're allowing them to, one company to be Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, and you're allowing Amazon to basically completely run markets and be able to cancel producers at a drop of a hat, and leaving a lot of producers of products in the dirt, and
or refusing to pay a decent wage to its workers.
Exactly. Or massively undercutting their competitors through artificially low prices, continuing to get financing, driving them out of business, buying them up. I mean, that's just Wild West type stuff, but it's legal, or it's been legal. America obviously bring a lot of charges against these big tech companies now, and big companies now. But I think really in those cases the problem is with regulation. And we as individuals should try and be the most socially responsible that we can be. But realistically, unfortunately, with the moral culture that we have, if something's available and it's legal, then people are going to end up shooting for it and doing it. If their aim is to basically be as successful, to get the most status, and to have as much money as possible.
Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of these monopolies that exist today, we've also benefited from them in many ways. Much of the technology that you and I use were built by many of these companies. So what would you say to capitalists that actually use this as one of their core arguments, that we wouldn't have much of the revolutionary innovations that we currently rely on without the current economic system that we're working within?
So there's almost two questions there. One is this criticism against the monopolies valid? And then B, the many of the innovations that we have stemmed from our overall capitalist culture, because I think that's slightly different. So I might answer those separately if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
So for the monopoly and the antitrust stuff, I mean, I would defer mainly to people who specialize in antitrust, and there's a really big emerging culture. Someone like Matt Stoller, who's written about this at length, who have shown that the most economic growth happened when we had, and the most beneficial growth happened when we had really strong antitrust, anti-monopoly laws that were rigorously enforced. And there's that guy Matt Stoller wrote a book called Goliath, which I'd really recommend to people. And he showed that when you had the highest levels of inequalities, you had the most monopolization. So that was, in the 1910s and then 1920s especially. And when the New Dealers took over with Roosevelt, etc., what they did was they brought in very stringent antitrust regulations, and that led to growth in many of those markets, and it led to much better competition, and it meant that the the wealth that these products are producing are shared over a much wider net. Because if you have just one company owning a sector which is taking in all that wealth, then all the money that's going into there is ultimately coming into one set of shareholders. If you divide that market up into multiple companies, then you have many more different people being involved in those enterprises, in those businesses, both in terms of employees and in terms of shareholders. So you actually get that wealth distributed much better. As consumers, often it'll be better in terms of pricing, but even in terms of producers of those individual parts, if you're a company that's building, I don't know, train tracks, and you're the only, or rather that's running trains and, taking care of that whole enterprise. If you're the only people who own the train tracks, then the producers of the individual parts are not going to have any kind of leverage to bargain with you. So they're going to be being ripped off. So very often, monopolies which seem good for consumers are hurting society in a different way, which is through they're outcompeting other people, and they're also being very unfair to different producers of the goods which they use. And then, if I may say, then after basically the World War II, you also had another big era of antitrust up until the 60s, 70s. And that was associated with the fastest economic growth in US and UK that we've ever had. So, a lot of the dynamism in the economic world comes from stringent regulations that are stopping monopolies. And things tend to slow down, and wealth tends to be much less equally distributed when you allow massive monopolization. In many cases, it's bad for consumers. It's especially bad for producers. So I think the history of the modern economic world itself bears testimony to the fact that we need quite strong antitrust and anti-monopoly regulations.
And what does that? Do you think any other economic models offer policies like that? So, for instance, socialism has recently garnered a lot of interest. So those that have seen the issues that exist with capitalism have turned to socialism. Can you elaborate what socialism is, and what are your thoughts on whether you consider it as a viable alternative to capitalism?
I think in a way socialists need to elaborate on what socialism is, and because it means so many different things to so many different people, and because historically it's basically just a label for we need to fight back against the excesses of our current economic system, which is capitalism. And we need to help workers. It's basically a movement on behalf of workers. And the general mechanism which has been proposed is state intervention and state ownership. And yes, kind of, the people who work in the mills ought to own them, and, the employees need to own the means or own their companies and cooperatives. But the reason why I say it's vague and it changes is because not necessarily all people who call themselves socialists today would agree to all of these different policies. Often it's defined as what they're against rather than what they're for. But I mean, in its spirit, I think it's a very, very positive and very, very good thing. And I've, in my own individual capacity, in a personal capacity, have aligned with political figures who would call themselves socialists, because essentially what they're saying is we need to fight back against, massive monopolization, against wealth inequalities. That's really good. The question is, do their mechanisms actually achieve their stated goals and their stated aims? And I think the problem is that they basically don't, because and the history itself bears out to that. Because if you're saying that we need to have massive regulation and tight regulation, and we need to base our currency on something a little bit better, and we need to have much stronger trade unions, then we had all those things in the West. We had all those things 40, 50 years ago. And slowly it unraveled. So why did it unravel? Was it just historical contingency? Or was it an inherent part of the system that you drive wealth inequalities, you produce economic elites who then capture the political landscape? And in my view, it's the latter. So socialism has very laudable aims in many respects, but if it's still working within our existing system, if it's still basically saying, well, yeah, we're going to have banks, they're going to be privately owned, we're going to have interest-bearing loans and a system of interest, and we're also not going to do anything on the moral side of things, because They can't, because it's just political policies, or they can change. And that's a different dimension to it, is how can you change your culture morally? But if you're saying, I'm going to stick within basically the same economic model, but regulate it better, it's like, okay, I look forward to the regulations all coming undone, because you're still going to be producing wealth inequalities, because your system tends towards that. So I'm skeptical that socialists can achieve the ends to which they aim. And my main evidence of that is that it failed in the past. And I think you don't have the intellectual or policy that's the resources needed to stop that happening again.
I mean, it sounds like, obviously much of socialism is driven by good intentions, and there is a level of morality there which is missing from most of capitalism. And there's all kinds of new movements around conscious capitalism and looking at the triple bottom line, where you're focusing on profit, planet, and purpose within your business structures. But something still seems to be missing in terms of how they will practically pan out from a mechanism perspective. So I'd be interested to hear from you, because based on what I'm hearing, what you're saying is capitalism doesn't work, socialism doesn't work. So what would you propose would be or should be the alternative, and what do you think will work?
So I think there are two aspects to this on the wider scale, which is, what are the policy things that we need to do, and also what are the moral and cultural things that we need to do. The moral and cultural things I think are very important, because even if you have very good policies, even if you have perfect policy making, and you can set up a bit of a virtuous circle, if fundamentally the people that are running the system are still, let's say, use a dramatic word or phrase, morally corrupt, if they are still don't really have the interests of the most vulnerable at heart, if they're still not really selfless, if they're in politics for themselves or for status or for wealth, then they have every incentive to change those policies. So you can put a bunch of great policies in place, but what is actually sustaining that is the humans that are in charge of those policies. And what you need to change there is you need to attack it from the moral and cultural point of view as well. So how do you produce a moral revolution in the world? How do you change people's views? Or rather, how do you change their actions and their behaviors? I think is ultimately going to be down to their worldviews. What worldviews do they hold? What do they think? Why are we here? Do they think that they're accountable for their actions? Do they think there's any intrinsic good to be helping others? From a religious perspective, when you are religious in what I would argue is the true sense, you love your creator, and therefore you naturally love your creation. Even if you've never met them before, in the same way that if you have a best friend and they have a kid, even if you've met that kid only once or twice, you have an inherent much greater love for them than you would for someone's kid that you just met off the street. Even if that kid you may have met once or twice as well. But because it's your friend's kid, you have a special attachment to them. In the same way, when you have when you cultivate a genuine relationship with the creator, you have a special attachment and a motivation to help their creation. And also on the flip side of things, the slightly harsher edge is religion says you are charged with being accountable for your actions, and you'll be punished in some form or you may be punished in some form if you don't take care of your responsibility to other people properly. And you will have a greater relationship, and you have a greater relationship of love with God if you do those things. So religion, I think, is a fantastic driving force towards morality. Not to say that there are no immoral religious people, or that religious history is not unchecked. But I think if religion is applied as it was originally taught, and followed properly, because you can have a text, but it's about whether people follow it. If they follow it properly, then you can produce great changes in the world. So that's the moral and cultural perspective. And then in terms of what kinds of things need to change from the policy perspectives, from the structure of our economic system, we've seen that, I think I've tried to argue that an interest-based system exacerbates inequalities naturally. So let's say you get rid of that. Okay, you get rid of interest. You don't have interest-bearing loans. Then how do you expand business? How do things work? Well, essentially, it'll be through equity stakes. It'll be through partnership. partnerships with between banks and businesses, or between the people and businesses. So what that'll mean is that you're financed, but the people who finance you take a stake in your business, and therefore have more motivation really to be involved with your business, and they'll share the risk. If the business doesn't do that well, then they lose some of their money, or all of their money, right? So what that means is that your financier class is intrinsically linked to the real economy, because at the moment we have a financial industry, we have the financial world, or what they call the financial economy, and you have the real economy. And for some reason, it's just accepted that these things are often very, very different. Financial economy is still doing very well, even though many people are becoming extremely unemployed and are having very difficult times. And it's always been the case that the financial world is very much disconnected from your real economy. But if you can intrinsically tie financing to your real economy, saying that your financiers will only make money if something makes money in the real economy, then you've changed the whole system. Then you're saying actually that that growth in the financial world is based upon real growth in the real economy. So that's something that traditionally has been done in the Islamic world, is especially further back in the past than our current world, is basing things much more on equity, on having risk sharing and profit sharing. So that's one major aspect that you can change in your financial system. Another is, what's your method of taxation? Because in the current system, we tax income, which I think is grossly unfair, because the working and much of the middle class live on their income, whereas the rich live on their wealth. They don't really care that much about income because they have so much capital and it kind of grows by itself in many respects, that they can live off that, and they're not hand to mouth if their income is taxed. But if you've got a 10, 20, 30, 40% income tax on people who don't have that kind of money and really, really need their paychecks, then you are essentially taxing the way that people live, and you're not hitting where the real tax base, which is in the wealth of the elites. So let's say we reverse that. Let's say we dramatically reduce income taxes, or even eliminate them, and you start proper wealth taxes. And it can be a marginal wealth tax. It can be, if you have wealth over a certain level, then we're going to tax you on that. Then you have, again, you've changed the game, because you're taking the money from the people at the top. And if you have good tax policies which distribute those amongst the poor, and you put it into social programs, into infrastructure projects, into things that really help people, then you can really change the game in terms of taxation and really work to reduce inequalities.
Do you think the economy could handle us doing a radical switch towards eliminating income tax and switching to wealth taxes?
I don't know. I think that needs to be modeled, to be honest. My own view is, I think that we should be much less reliant on income taxes and much more reliant on wealth taxes, for that basic fact, because that's where the money is, and the people, and it hurts people at the bottom of the rung much more. So how you do that has to be tried and tested in policy itself. But I think the principle, in my view, is sound. So you should aim towards that. And if you have a marginal wealth tax as well, it also gives an incentive for people to not accumulate too much wealth. And the only way that, if you have you don't allow people to siphon off wealth to tax havens, the way that they're going to be able to use their wealth and not just let it accumulate is to reinvest it back into society and back into genuine business in the real economy. And that itself will do a lot of the government's job for it. It will produce a lot of growth. And then I think from the Islamic perspective, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, from a tax angle, I think that makes complete sense. I mean, it's just shocking that it's just never been implemented in our Western economic systems. I'm just curious to understand why that hasn't been proposed up until, recently. We're seeing so much talk around wealth taxes. Why do you think it's never been trialed before, outside of the Islamic economy?
Yeah, it's important to say I didn't just make up that wealth tax thing. That's called zakat, and it's an Islamic. It's a core tenet of Islamic economics, and obviously getting rid of interest is something that's a major part of Islamic economics, and maybe we can touch on a few other aspects later. But why has it not been trialed? I think the reason is because the people who are producing the policy. It's not in their interest, basically. It's not in people's it's not for the super wealthy's interest from a materialistic point of view to lose their money. And since they fund all the think tanks which produce your economic policy, since they often have direct financing of political or political actors through lobbying, and they also have kind of cognitive capture through their think tanks and through universities, etc., of the landscape, they've been against it, and they can always make up slightly invented models of economics and say, well, this is why this would be bad. And everything, it's interesting, everything tends to be bad which doesn't favor them, and everything that favors them tends to be actually really makes a lot of sense economically. So I think that's on a very simple level, that's why we haven't seen those things. And it's only in recent years, with the massive civil unrest after the 2008 crash and the austerity policies, that we've talk about wealth taxes. And a lot of it came out of Piketty, French economist Thomas Piketty, who wrote that book, Capital in the 21st Century. And he said what I was saying in terms of, that the history of capitalism is basically a history of increasing wealth inequality. And that's only been changed through massive state intervention, plus minus massive destruction of wealth. So the world wars, it went down. And then after the world wars, you obviously had better governments than we have now. You had a recognition that we need to do things for the poor who have just, so many of them have died in the war. So we're going to have massive state intervention. We're going to really regulate things well. We're going to try and run our economy responsibly. They did that for 1 or 2 decades, but even in the 60s, you had then the elites having their own intellectuals saying we need to completely change things, and we need to essentially rig the system in favor of the rich, which is what neoliberalism is. So then you get basically massive wealth inequalities exploding again. So that's what capitalism is tending towards. That's its natural inclination, is to increase wealth inequalities. The 20th century bears that out. So we need to have policies that make a system tend towards equality rather than towards inequality. And the things I just mentioned, stopping interest and having a marginal wealth tax are 2 policies which I think would really help. And Piketty himself obviously famously said, I think we need a wealth tax. And then members of our team actually emailed him saying, this is like a age-old, 1400-year-old Islamic thing. And he was like, oh, very interesting, send me more. And he did read some more. And then he quoted one of our writers actually in his latest book. And but to put it mildly, I think he may not have appreciated fully what we were saying. So a response is being prepared.
Okay. Interesting. And obviously, he came to his own conclusion completely independent of
amazing
what
work, yeah.
And of what Islam advocates within its Islamic economic model, which is more proof of what is being proposed under this economic system. So it'll be interesting to hear more about. So you've mentioned shareholding, you've mentioned risk sharing, you've mentioned wealth taxes. What else embodies the concept of an Islamic economic system, and how exactly would a business operating within that economy work to uplift marginalized groups and reduce wealth inequalities, so reverse the damage that has been done by today's capitalism?
Well, I think it's not necessarily just what would those companies do as if like through charitable drives that they would work, but actually if you change the structure of your economy such that you have a wider distribution of wealth, and that you have lots of smaller businesses which are much more locally owned and locally driven, and that they're zebras all over the place, and you have their structures or their dividends are going towards much more normal people rather than a super elite that has all the shareholdings in all the different companies, then that itself means that more people are going to be better off, and therefore they're going to be economic winners rather than an increasingly small number of winners and an increasingly large number of losers. In fact, actually, just on that point, I don't think the way that we have shareholders is the ideal system, but even in our system, I was having a look at the the ONS stats on this recently, on how much of the population are shareholders, And in the 60s, it was like 65% of the population were shareholders. And now it's down to 13%. And it was in the 70s that you see a massive drop, 70s and 80s. And that's exactly when all the kind of neoliberal reforms came in. So even as a gross measure, it's very interesting that even on this gross measure, you have a massive reduction of who who is a shareholder in your society, which I think is a reasonable proxy of who is basically richer, who is getting money not just from their paycheck. And obviously, even within that 13%, it'll probably be a very, very tiny sliver of that actually owns, numerically or in terms of value, most of the shares in your world. But I think if you have these policies, if you have greater distribution of wealth through your zakat, through your wealth taxes, if you have financing that is much more equity driven, then you're not going to have massive companies that are artificially boosted that can outcompete everyone through monopolization. You're going to have a greater level of smaller businesses which are much more jointly owned by higher numbers of people, and that itself naturally is going to increase the wealth in your society. Does that make sense? Do you buy that or not?
I do. I mean, based on my understanding, I believe Islamic economics goes a bit deeper into the role that businesses play. I feel like the responsibility of a business owner is also to ensure that the people that it's employing are protected, whether it's making sure that their income is delivered by the time that their sweat dries up. I mean, there's a whole saying around that within Islam. Making sure people are paid on time, they are paid well, they are offered the right training and education so that they're empowered to come out of their whatever their condition is, so that they can learn or be equipped to stand on their own 2 feet and become financially independent. And I think that ultimately drives what Islamic economics has to offer in terms of helping marginalized groups become financially independent and helping them become leaders within society. But we can only do that when businesses create the means, whether it's through resources or it's through financing. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts on whether you think that is also a part of Islamic economics, and what more can we see from businesses beyond, looking at shareholding, moving away from interest-based financing, and moving more towards fair trade practices?
Those are great points. I'm glad you raised them actually, because I was out at the time overlooking them actually. And it occurred to me when you said that, if you let's take the example of early Islam, and I think this captures the spirit of it quite well. In early Islam, you had the Muslims that were hugely persecuted through various wars. And the Meccans were following them literally 200 miles north up to Medina and were waging wars against them then. And eventually the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was permitted, in our view, by God to actually respond and fight those defensive wars. Now, in those wars, prisoners of wars were taken. Just in the current world, we have prisoners of war. In today, they're put into, camps with often shocking conditions. But obviously in olden times, they didn't have those kind of, buildings where they could keep people. So they were distributed amongst ordinary people, prisoners of war, as long as the war was going on, in the Islamic perspective or in the Islamic history. So as long as the wars were going on, they were permitted to keep those prisoners of war. Because if you let them go, they'd go back and join their armies and then kill your brother and your sister. So that wasn't a good idea. But Islam gave so many regulations that it's just amazing in terms of how to treat them. So these were people that literally come out of their way, often hundreds of miles, to come and kill you. And the Quranic teachings were, you have to treat them basically as you treat yourself and your own family. Feed them as you feed yourself. Clothe them as you clothe yourself. And one of the primary ways, and it says that you have to offer them you have to allow them to pay their way to freedom. Or you can just let them go. Just let them go. If their family comes and they want to ransom them, you can do that as well. You can let them go of your own accord. But if none of those routes are available, you don't necessarily want to let them go because you're very poor yourself and there's no one that's come to get them ransomed, then they still have the right to get their freedom. And the way that Islam said they'd do it is they had to basically put they had to earn it through showcasing their skills and through helping the society around them. So for instance, if they could read, let's say, they would have to teach some children to read and improve the literacy, right? And then that would be their kind of debt for coming to murder your compatriots. Be like, okay, well, that you've paid off your debt, you're now free to go. So it's amazing what Islam did, is that even people that were, very objectively your enemies, it said, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to treat you very well, and we're going to feed you and clothe you like we feed and clothe ourselves. And if the route is taken that they need to earn their freedom, it'll be by doing something which is socially beneficial, by working in society, and then they'll get their freedom, and they'll be also given some money, generally some capital, to kind of go their own way as well. So I think that it's a very extreme case, but it sums up a lot of the spirit of Islam, which is about you have a responsibility to others. The Prophet said, I think he said, everyone is a shepherd. Everyone has people under their responsibility, and all of the things that we have, our wealth, our intellectual capacities, our time, all of these are trusts from God. That's the essential Islamic teaching in respect to economics, is all of your resources of a nation and on an individual level are trusts from God, and you'll be judged according to how you use them. So you need to use them in a way that benefits as many people as possible, and you use it in a responsible way. So I think that kind of goes back to how these actual companies will act individually. If you have that at the forefront of your mind, and you're thinking, I'm going to be judged for this, but also I'm inspired by love for my creator to help his creation. And, even if you don't necessarily subscribe to those views, there are many people who just have a good level of baseline morality. If that is kind of accentuated from them, and that you have a culture which lays heavy stress upon that, then the individual decisions that businesses make are going to be much, much better. So I think that kind of it speaks to what you are asking.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, a lot of people may be listening to this and they may not subscribe to the Islamic faith, or to any faith for that matter. Do you think Islamic economics is a model that could work for just is it only available to Muslims, or is it something that could be adopted on a global level?
I would say in many respects, they have adopted parts of Islamic economics without quite realizing it. So the big revolution of the 90s post-war economy was that you had the state. Britain, in many respects, was the pioneer of this. The state saying, okay, we're going to try and provide for your basic needs, where the state is now taking the responsibility upon itself to make sure people have clothing, shelter, that they have health, that they have education. And you had a big expansion of these things, and it came to define the modern spirit of British politics, often fought against by others. So that is something which we see as a great blessing of the modern age, is the birth of the so-called welfare state, and basically the state saying, okay, we're going to collectively take care of each other. This was something which Islam put into practice, 1400 years ago. And the best example of this, the best earliest example of this, was Hazrat Umar, the same caliph, may Allah be pleased with him, because he very, very specifically did a massive census of Medina. He found out who people were, what were their requirements, and how were they being met. Does everyone have food? Does everyone have clothing? Does everyone have shelter, etc.? And there's a famous story, which I'm sure you know, of how he was essentially roaming the streets at night undercover to kind of find out how things were and what the state of his nation was. And that itself shows the moral caliber of him. He was doing it undercover so that people wouldn't really be able to see him. And he heard...
he would go up to them and help them, but still not allow them to identify him.
Yeah, exactly. And in this particular instance, he heard this woman crying out and saying, oh God, I think she said, oh God, curse Umar. And he was like, why? And he went to her and tried to find out. And she said, not knowing who he is, well, look at the state that he's left me in. And so he went back and he kind of got supplies for her and provisions for her. And while he was coming back, his servant said, or one of his assistants said, can I carry that for you? And he said, you can carry this now, but who will carry my burden on the day of resurrection? Right. So that shows the effect that your worldview and that religion in particular, and Islam in particular, can have on someone. is that sense of responsibility in your leaders, and also that the policies are about providing for people and meeting their basic needs. And in fact, he pioneered even essentially a form of UBI. It wasn't completely universal, but I think it was for like pregnant mothers, for people that were starting out after puberty and trying to get jobs. He would provide them with capital. And we have an article on this on our website, rationalreligion.co.uk. If you type in even Umar, you'll get the article. I think it's called The Forgotten Economic Revolution of Hazrat Umar. And it goes into detail of all of these.
We can link it in the show notes.
Yes. And it goes into detail about, how the early Islamic State pioneered lots of these things. And this isn't a coincidence. The Holy Quran specifically says basically that with the birth of prophethood, people were charged to take care of each other and provide for food, water, shelter, and clothing. And education is also involved in the Arabic of it. So it said that these 4 to 5 things need to be provided for, and that this is a responsibility of your leaders. So the Muslims did this. And
was that just for Muslims?
Right. So you're saying, is this something only Muslims could do? Well, everything I've said could be adopted by people of no faith or of different faiths. These are policy recommendations that we're making. Change your don't have an interest-based system, implement marginal wealth taxes. And there are other things that Islam says. It has, an emphasis on charity. It has about a 20% royalty on mineral resources. It really advocates for the circulation of wealth. So there are other things as well. But none of these things do I have to say, I believe in one God and that the Prophet Muhammad is his messenger, per se. There's nothing stopping others from adopting these things. And as I've said, in many cases, they have independently found that these things are things that we should be doing, like having a welfare state that takes care of each other, that takes care of, their population, like saying maybe we should have a wealth taxes. So this is, I think, probably the angle that you're coming from in terms of re-envisioning business, is you're trying to find ideas that, everyone can have. And everyone can implement. And I think Islamic economics is a rich source of that, because these are policies anyone can implement. You don't have to be Muslim. It applies equally well for Muslims and non-Muslims. And I think people should look into it, because they could be quite well pleased with what they find.
Thank you, Umar. Is there anything that you would like to add? I think a common question that comes to my mind that I often get asked about is Islamic economics a socialist model, or is it a capitalist model? I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts on that are.
It combines the best parts of both, and it rejects the worst parts of both. So the best parts of socialism is about, as I say, socialist is a little bit of an ill-defined concept, but let's take communism as an extreme example of socialism. It agrees with the idea that we need to take care of everybody, that we need to have people's basic needs met, which is something we don't have in this country. There are still people on the streets. There are still people who are extremely poor here. In America, for instance, they don't even have healthcare for so many people. So that's something which, people haven't even reached the basic levels of provision. So it takes that aspect of socialism and says, yes, we need to do that. But it also allows individualistic enterprise. It allows people to really excel if they have capacity to, and it rewards them for that. It doesn't demonize profit, but it says that there should be a limit, and you should have policies that make sure that capital doesn't concentrate, because when your capital concentrates, when money concentrates, you then have concentration of power, and those powerful people will rig the system. So I think it's a blend of the two, without their problems, but with their merits. I'd like to hear from you, because you're someone who's, a pioneer in your own business, and you've been very active in kind of, advocating for better systems. What's your feeling of, how much is there an appetite out there to really change things on a systemic level, rather than on, I don't know, maybe more smaller scale things? Do people recognize that a lot of these issues may be systemic, and have they put their finger on what the root causes may be?
What I've seen within the social enterprise community and just the wider circles that I try and learn from, or I try and observe, there is no doubt that everyone has recognized within that group that there is a larger systemic problem that is affecting many areas of the way we live our lives, whether it's the world of business, whether it's the world of fashion. I mean, we see fashion so heavily capitalized, and the fast fashion industry, the way it exists, for instance, is just absolutely horrendous. That's just one example. Then we see the world of we see the world of conservation, so the impact that businesses have on the environment and the need for better systems in place to actually protect our lands, protect indigenous groups and marginalized groups that have always kind of protected those areas, but they're actively being pushed away. Every area of our systems has been exploited in some way, and I feel like people are finally rising up to the challenges that exist with our current economic system. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to start this podcast, because there's so many people out there working on a variety of different concepts and thought processes around how we can reshape the economy and rebuild the way we do business. But a lot of those solutions are very fragmented. A lot of people are still trying to figure out what a world without capitalism looks like. And then they will often lean towards socialism because that's the only alternative that they know of. But then once they dig into socialism, they realize actually socialism, on a practical level won't really work. So then they go back to capitalism, and it's just this back to and fro situation that they're always kind of stuck in a loop of. And what they're really looking for is a new model. And every time I see those conversations, I participate in those conversations, I often think that if only they understood the power of Islamic economics and what that model has to offer to the world. Even if you don't subscribe to the Islamic faith, there are so many principles that are focused on making sure that individuals can acquire an income, can generate wealth, but at the same time, it's never at the expense of one another, because your ultimate goal within this world should be to protect your sisters, your brothers, whether that's the stranger that's living next door or it's someone that's living across the world. We all need to be mindful of everyone that exists and walks on the same land as us, and how we can be mindful of protecting them in our transactions and our day-to-day dealings. And it makes such a frequent occurrence in all of my conversations. And it's just a shame that we on the flip side, I kind of understand that there aren't enough working examples that we can present to them in the current modern world. I think that one of the big problems that exist is that we have Muslim countries that claim to practice Islamic economics, but they're not actually implementing the system in the way that Islam had originally proposed. And if we look to them for inspiration, we're of course going to be let down. We're not going to be inspired by those models. And so, the non-Muslim world says, okay, so where do we turn to? What models should we look towards to find that inspiration? Because there is no working example. So I guess that's one of the challenges that exists within the Islamic economy. And so I would like to see more robust examples and businesses coming out of the new generation. That's there have been a lot of businesses that are looking to transform the way Islamic finance, for instance, works as an industry, how businesses can cater to the non-Muslim market, because a lot of Islamic-based businesses have catered to Muslim audiences specifically, when really businesses should cater to every audience, and their services should be made available to everyone, unless of course you're targeting you've got a very niche offering. But really, you shouldn't prohibit specific segments of society from accessing your services, because those services should be for the good of humanity and for the good of society, and therefore should be available to everyone. So I think I'd like to see more examples of businesses. But in answer to your question, yes, there is a huge appetite for a new system that caters to the challenges that a lot of people have identified and alleviates the challenges that people are experiencing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I think those are great points that you made about that there's no example, because that's who you look at, really, isn't there? On an individual level, if you let's say you really agree with the faith, but you know people who subscribe to that faith but actually don't have the moral character which is reflective of it, it can be very off-putting. And again, if that happens on a wider scale, in terms of if you have Muslim majority countries, maybe sometimes they even say, oh yeah, we're practicing some Islamic finance here and there, but then you see great injustices in those societies on multiple levels, then you're going to be like, well, you guys don't have the answer. When the reality may be they may well have the answer, but they're not willing to implement it because their hearts have turned away from the spirit of their religion. Which is why, saying about things are always top down and bottom up. It's about the people who are implementing the policies as well as the policies themselves. And if you have one without the other, you can make progress, but you can only get so far. So that's why I think we need both a moral and a cultural revolution in this world, and we also need a policy revolution. And I guess your point is, well, we can't change the whole world. Let's do what we can in our spheres and try and improve our relations with others and try and produce working business models as well, and go on from there, lest we become YouTubers who simply rant and rave and don't actually do anything productive. So I applaud you for that.
You can find Umar Nasser on his YouTube channel.
Exactly.